So looking at the respiratory system first today, we are going to be sort of breaking out and looking at like how oxygen is being exposed to our bloodstream, because that is how that oxygen is actually going to do the work of diffusing into our blood in order for our blood to be able to carry it around. So we already talked about sort of the delivery guys yesterday, when we were talking about the cardiovascular system. That was describing how we are sort of moving stuff throughout the body, right? Like cardiovascular system is actually responsible for doing all the heavy lifting of transporting nutrients. But the respiratory system is going to do the heavy lifting of extracting those nutrients. And in this case, the nutrient that we're talking about is oxygen, the most important nutrient in the entire body. I know, like when we talk about nutrition, usually we're talking about proteins, fats, carbs, vitamins, minerals, and water. Oxygen's not even on that list. But O2 molecules are our most vital nutrient. Like you can go a couple, days without food. You can go I guess you can go like a couple weeks without food in like extreme scenarios. You can go a couple days without water. You can only go a couple minutes without oxygen, and that kind of just goes to show how freaking important the stuff is. So we have to have a system that's sort of, anatomically very good at extracting O2 molecules from the atmosphere, because the atmosphere isn't even mostly O2. Most of the atmosphere that we're breathing in is actually nitrogen. So we are going to sort of look at some of the structure there. I'm not going to spend too much time on like some parts of this. We're really going to spend most of our time looking at the actual lungs and then like bronchi. We will then talk about the process of respiration, sort of how that works, ventilation versus, gas exchange and stuff. Disorders of the respiratory system, not so much. Aging, not so much, and certainly not the special equipment for treatment, because that's not really our area. So here's what we're looking at when it comes down to the respiratory system, right? So this is the system responsible for like proper cellular functioning in the body. And sometimes that seems kind of weird. You're like, what, proper cellular function? That doesn't sound like breathing, like breathing just kind of sounds like, yeah, it like brings air. It's like, well, why do you think we bring that air in? That is what our cells like mostly feed on, right? We need O2 in order to like, produce ATP, and ATP is what keeps our cells alive. It's the energy that, actually allows us to do everything, right? So, we definitely need to have like this process, and every animal on the planet needs that, right? Like everyone needs to be able to, every animal needs to be able to like take in O2 molecules and like, create cellular respiration and then like spit out CO2. There's not an animal on the planet that doesn't do that. That's, something that we all kind of share in common. But some of us do it in very, very different ways, like fish, for instance. Like, what happens is like they have their gills, which as they move through water, it sort of like breaks apart O2 from like the H2O, and that's how they extract oxygen. It's a pretty good way to do it, but like unfortunately it doesn't bring in a lot, right? So then like eventually what ended up happening is like, we ended up with like actually, some creature developed lungs, particularly the lungfish, and lungs actually move that oxygen extraction inside the body. And what's very cool about that is the fact that like it allows for a massive amount of O2 to be exposed to blood, so it can extract more. And that ended up leading to bigger and more complicated creatures. And, eventually here we are. So the respiratory system really does ensure proper cellular function. That's really its main job when you kind of break it down. But it's going to do that by extracting oxygen from the environment so that our body cells can utilize that, right? And so when we're talking about the process of breathing, what we mean to say is that we are experiencing respiration, right? And so respiration is the process of getting oxygen molecules from the environment and delivering it to our cells. So when you look at like the actual atmosphere, if you look at the composition of air, Actually might not quite be what I need. Yeah, there it is. So you can see most of it is actually nitrogen, right? Like most of it is like nitrogen gas as atmosphere, right? 21% of it's oxygen, right? And then some of it's like argon, you know, and then like there's like neon in there and like all kinds of other like weird, you know, metals and stuff that are actually like kind of floating around in the atmosphere. You know, like neon is a gas, right? Looks like this when you like run a bunch of light through it. And that's where we get like neon lights from. So you just capture a bunch of that gas, fill a glass tube, and then run some light through it, and it kind of, you know, makes a really cool looking color. And that's where neon's at. That's our atmosphere. We're breathing that in all the time. Very little amounts of it, but you know, some of it does come in there. Some of it's carbon dioxide. You know, there's obviously like other creatures on this planet that are all exhaling, and you know, so some of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, but very little. But the stuff that we need is the oxygen, right? Oxygen is what's going to allow us to kind of bring in those O2 molecules to spit out energy, right? That's what our mitochondria are responsible for. So we definitely want to have like a good system for doing that. And so we have like our lungs and then all of the anatomic structures in our lungs. So when we talk about like respiration, we're going to break this down into 4 distinct phases here. The first one is going to be pulmonary ventilation. So remember yesterday we were talking about the pulmonary circuit, right? Pulmonary circuit is the circuit of blood vessels going to and from the lungs. So pulmonary is, whenever we hear that word, we're talking about the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation is the lungs creating an area of, again, we're going back to what we talked about yesterday, low pressure. So when your lungs expand, there is less pressure in the lungs than there is in the atmosphere. That's what causes all the gas to drive into our body. And then ventilation is the process of like moving gas, right? So we are moving gas through the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation is the process of driving massive amounts of gas into lungs. This gas being air, which again is mostly nitrogen, but there is a lot of oxygen in there as well. So that's the first thing we do, right? Our diaphragm contracts, that expands our lungs, air goes rushing into the body, right? Step 1. Step 2 is going to be what we call an external gas exchange. Now, we want to think of it as an external gas exchange because this is where our blood is interacting with the atmosphere, even though it's happening inside our chest. Weirdly enough, guys, I know we have to go back to this concept. I've said this a lot of times. Chris and Simon and Julio, you guys are probably tired of hearing me say this at this point, but we are all human donuts. You know, we have little bits of outside that happen to run through the center of our body, right? Like, you know, if I kind of draw this out here, it's kind of like this, right? If you've got this, like, you know, if you've got your mouth, right? I don't know how to draw like a human head, but like, you know, let's say like you've got this like, you know, tube that kind of runs down, right? If I go like this, right? This bit right here is still like outside, right? Now, even if I have like, let's say I have like a flap here, obviously this is not a human mouth, but like, let's say like I put a flap here, right? So now there's like a flap that can kind of close over the top of this, right? You know, this is the outside here. This is still the outside right here, right? Again, going back to the donut thing, right? We got like a hole with a hole in the center. This is outside, right? This is inside, even though it happens to be running through the center. That is exactly how your lungs work, which is why we call this an external gas exchange. It is your blood being exposed to the outside environment, even though it is taking place inside of your chest cavity. Right. So, so look at that. Let's see if I can find a picture here. There we go. Right. You can kind of see, actually, that's even better. You can see this external gas exchange, right? This is an open, uninterrupted tube, whether it's going through the nose or going through the mouth. Everything inside the lungs there is still like the outside environment. It just happens to be running through our chest cavity. So that is external gas exchange. And what external gas exchange is it is where oxygen is going to enter the red blood cells and CO2 is going to leave. the red blood cells. So we are exchanging oxygen for CO2. Okay, so CO2, carbon dioxide, is the byproduct of using oxygen as an energy producer, right? So we basically bring oxygen in so we can use it to take the carbohydrates in our food, or take the carbon inside of like a fat molecule, or even like a molecule of protein, and we cleave it and turn it into a bunch of energy. Then once we're done with that oxygen, what we do is we have the leftover carbon, we attach it to the oxygen molecule, we need to get it to the lungs, we need to get rid of it, right? And so that's what's happening in the external gas exchange. We are exhaling, we are moving the CO2 from the blood into the lungs. We're moving oxygen from the lungs into the blood. And that way a red blood cell can drop off its CO2, pick up oxygen, get back to wherever it needs to go, drop off the oxygen, pick up CO2, rinse and repeat, right? And that's what's happening. It's just a one-to-one exchange there, right? So the next thing, stage 3, is exactly what I just described with that red blood cell. It's the gas transport, right? The red blood cell is going to transport oxygen to whatever tissue it needs to get to, right? So it's going to travel wherever it happens to be going. You know, in this case, let's say I'm walking, it's my calf muscles, you know? And then what happens is when that red blood cell gets to one of my calf muscles, we'll experience another gas exchange in reverse, right? That is going to be the internal gas exchange. So an internal gas exchange is happening between my blood and the rest of the tissues of my body. This is very much inside the body. We're not in the atmosphere anymore, right? We're not the human donut in this moment, right? This is just the inside exchange there. And so we are driving oxygen into the tissue of the body. We're driving CO2 out of the tissue into the body, into the red blood cell. And so it can rinse and repeat, right? So if we look at like the phases of respiration here. Come on, internet, give me a chart. Well, that's hilarious. That's cellular respiration. That's a picture that I had. I think that's from our PowerPoints. Where is, let's see here. Internal gas exchange versus external gas. I got a picture of it in the next slide, but there we go. So this is constantly what's happening here, right? You can see, you can see like pulmonary ventilation starts, right, by bringing oxygen into a red blood cell. That oxygen is going to get exchanged for CO2. It's going to carry that red blood cell, you know, it's going to carry that oxygen around. It's going to go to some type of tissue inside the body, drop that oxygen off, pick up CO2, and then CO2 is going to get back to the lungs, drop off CO2, pick up oxygen. And it's just a big constant, you know, exchange of two little ingredients there, right? Kind of like us, right? Like we exchange money for, you know, all the stuff that allows us to kind of keep on living, and then like we go do work so that we can earn more of it. Yeah, it's just kind of a constant like loop, right? And so those are sort of the 4 main phases of respiration. It starts with like creating low pressure so that air becomes exposed to the red blood cells. Then they can experience an external gas exchange. They transport it to the tissue, and then they do an internal gas exchange. And then they would go back to like gas transport, by the way. They would go right back to step 3, but then that would end in step 1, right? So technically it would go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, it's just gas transport, you know, part due. So here's that happening, right? And again, the heart is what's pumping this blood around, right? Allowing this sort of like movement and exchange to occur. So out here, we've got like our body cells, like in the upper body. Here's our body cells in the lower body, and here's the lungs. So let's take a red blood cell that for the very first time, right? It's never picked up anything before. And so it just kind of gets to the heart sort of passively here. You know, drops into the right atrium, goes to the right ventricle, gets pumped over to the lungs. For the very first time, it picks up oxygen, right? And doesn't have any CO2 to drop off because it's never really done any work before. So then it gets sucked back over to the heart, into the left ventricle, left atrium, into the left ventricle, gets pumped out to some type of tissue in the body. Now it is going to drop off its oxygen, but it's going to exchange it for CO2. So it gives, let's say the brain here, a little bit of the O2, and then the O2 is like, great, well, I did some energy production before you got here, So here's some CO2 in exchange. Whoop! So now that red blood cell picks up CO2 for the first time, travels back to the heart, right atrium, right ventricle, goes back over to the lungs, drops off the CO2, picks up oxygen for the second time, and then rinses and repeats that whole cycle. And that is respiration. That is our cardiorespiratory system working very intimately together. So if we're looking at how this actually happens, if we're looking at like our, how we are driving this air and exposing it to the atmosphere, we have to look at some of our respiratory passageways here, right? So you're going to divide your respiratory system into two primary divisions, right? Like we had the three divisions of our cardiovascular system. It relies on your heart to pump everything around. It relies on blood vessels to allow everything to travel. It relies on blood to actually transport stuff. So blood vessels in the heart, that's the cardiovascular system. Your respiratory system is made up of your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. The respiratory pump is that diaphragm that drives air into and out of your lungs, and the respiratory passageways are all the like little tubes that are conducting oxygen to wherever it needs to go. So looking at that, you can kind of see it here, right? Here's the diaphragm down here. That's the respiratory pump, all the muscles. And like your ribs would be part of the respiratory pump. Like they weigh your chest down, right? In order to like kind of push air out of it. You get your intercostal muscles, little muscles between all your ribs. They're doing that as well. But primarily the diaphragm is sort of the king of the pump here. So the diaphragm is going to contract down. That's going to expand the lungs. It's like taking a sack and pulling it open, air goes rushing into that sack, right? That's how you when you use a suction cup, right? Like, you put the suction cup on whatever surface, and then you push, so it creates like it pushes all the air out of there. And now it has this like there's no air in there. It's a very area of low pressure. So what happens is like everything wants to rush in there, but you sealed it. So then it just kind of grips whatever it is that you're suctioning. So there's an area of low pressure in the lungs now, and so that's what's going to drive gas in there. So there's your respiratory pump, and the respiratory passageways are things like your trachea, your nasal cavities, like all of these tubes that branch down and then thread into those big empty sacs, and then they branch smaller and smaller and smaller, very similarly to how our blood vessels do. So you guys know how much I love to make sure that you get animations. This is my way of not having to draw very often. Short crash course videos who, paid to have somebody else animate all this stuff. Here is our respiratory system here, talking about like driving this gas in.
Would you like to learn science on Brilliant? Brilliant gets you hands-on to help you learn by doing.
Let me introduce you to one of the bravest pioneers in the history of life on planet Earth. An organism that blazed the trail for every single vertebrate that lives on land today and many that don't. It's one of your most important ancestors. Meet? Well, it doesn't have a name. And we don't exactly know what it looked like either. But we do know that about 380 million years ago, this fishy-looking thing with big fleshy fins achieved one of the animal kingdom's greatest milestones, breathing air. Sounds simple enough, but believe me, it wasn't. Because for billions of years before this fishy ancestor came around, basically all of life evolved in water. From the very beginning, the earliest, simplest forms of life, like bacteria, extracted oxygen they needed right from the water through their membranes. And they did it through simple diffusion, when a material automatically flows from where it is concentrated to where it is less concentrated, so it balances out. Diffusion works really well, and it requires zero effort, but it wasn't going to cut it in the big leagues. Anything larger than a small worm is simply too big and needs too much oxygen for diffusion to work. So in order to get bigger, early life forms needed a circulatory system that could move bulk amounts of oxygen around faster inside their bodies, and a respiratory system to bring more oxygen in contact with their wet membranes. So their respiratory surfaces moved from their outer surfaces surfaces to the insides of their bodies. First there were gills, but gills of course still only work inside of water. And a little more than 380 million years ago, this was starting to lose some of its charm. Earth was getting warmer, the seas were getting shallower, and much of the planet's surface water had lower concentrations of oxygen than it used to. Finally, a humble little lobe-finned fish got fed up, swam up to the water's surface, and started breathing air. It could do this because it had evolved a fancy new interface to move gases between the air and its cell membranes. I'm talking about lungs. Wet lungs. With an efficient new way to take in nearly limitless amounts of oxygen from air, animals were eventually able to get bigger and more diverse over the ages, and now all of us lung-having vertebrates share that common ancestor. For lots of animals, including humans, those lungs come with a bunch of other equipment like protective ribs, a stiff trachea, and in mammals, a strong diaphragm. And together, they form your respiratory system, which happens to be best friends and business partners with your circulatory system. It's only by working together and using both the bulk flow and simple diffusion of oxygen that they can make possible the process of cellular respiration. In other words, life itself. So a lot of improvements have been made to it over the eons, but the respiratory system that you are using right now is your inheritance from that ancient, ambitious fish, leader of one of the most important anatomical revolutions of the past 500 million years. Pretend for a minute that you can't breathe. Like, you just don't have lungs anymore. You are some bizarre evolutionary oddity, a huge human-shaped organism that doesn't have a respiratory system. Instead, you get all of your oxygen the way that your oldest, smallest evolutionary ancestors did, by simple diffusion, or at least you try to get all your oxygen that way. How would it work? Well, poorly. And that's partly because one of the keys to efficient diffusion of any material is distance. If you want a molecule to diffuse across a space quickly, you want it to be as close to its destination as possible with the fewest obstacles in the way. But for a single molecule of oxygen to diffuse from the air through, say, your scalp and then go to a neuron deep inside your brain, it would have to move through your skin and then your skull and then your connective tissue and all sorts of things. It would eventually get there, like maybe a month later, but at that point the cell that needed the oxygen in the first place would have, suffocated to death. Basically, obtaining oxygen through diffusion alone is like wanting to go to a party at your friend's place across town and then walking 20 miles to get there. You could do it, but it would take forever, and by the time you arrived, you'd be all haggard and the party would be over. So diffusion alone isn't enough to get the job done. We do use it, but only when a whole bunch of the materials we need are right up against the tissues that can absorb them. So you know what else we need? Bulk flow. Bulk flow is like public transportation. It moves large numbers of molecules quickly. Rather than walk the whole way across town, you can hop on a bus with a bunch of other people and get there in 20 minutes. Every time you take a deep breath, you bring in about 100 quintillion oxygen molecules into your lungs all at once. They're on a bulk flow bus ride. And once those oxygen molecules filter down into the cells in your lungs, they're suddenly very close to the blood they're trying to reach. All they have to do is diffuse across 4 layers of cell membranes to get from the lung cell into the blood. It's like hopping off the bus and then walking a half a block to your friend's apartment. That's why your respiratory system is the way it is. It's set up to take full advantage of both bulk flow and simple diffusion. The bulk flow part of things is handled by some of your system's biggest and most obvious moving parts, starting with your lungs, which basically operate like a pump or a bellows. They don't have any contractible muscle tissue because they need to be able to expand, so they require outside help in order to move. Enter the diaphragm, a big thin set of muscles that separates your thorax from your abdomen. When your lungs empty, your diaphragm relaxes and looks kind of like an arc pushing up to squish your lungs. You also have the weight of your rib cage pushing on your lungs from the top and sides, and together these forces decrease the volume of your lungs. When you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, pulling itself flat, and your external intercostal muscles between your ribs contract. They lift the ribs up and out, causing the chest cavity to expand. This makes the pressure inside your lungs lower than the air outside your body, and since fluids like gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, the lungs fill up with outside air. Then the diaphragm relaxes again, and the weight of the ribs settles in, and the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the outside air, and the air rushes out. And that, my friends, is breathing 101. Now, your respiratory system contains a lot of parts besides your lungs, some prominently displayed on your face, others hidden deep within your chest, and functionally all of these organs fall into one of 2 physiological zones. The upper parts that funnel the air in make up what's known as the conducting zone, and it starts with this thing. Your nose is supported by bone and cartilage and the bristly hairs and mucus inside it that help filter out dust and other particles. But it, along with your sinuses, performs another important function. It warms and moistens incoming air so it doesn't dry out those sensitive lung cells that must remain wet. Remember, moisture is key. We evolved from organisms that lived in water, so just like with our aquatic bacterial ancestors, we need water for oxygen to dissolve into before it can diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer membrane of our cells. Now, if you've ever choked on a poorly timed sip of water, you've noticed that you breathe through the same tube that you also move foods and liquids through. This is yet another leftover from those first fish lungs, which evolved as a branch off the esophagus. Looking back, it was not ideal, but we are stuck with it. So the stuff that you swallow soon encounters the epiglottis, a little trapdoor of tissue which covers the larynx and directs bites of sandwich and sips of cola towards your esophagus and keeps them out of your lungs. And you'll notice that the esophagus, which heads to your stomach, is nice and flexible, while your trachea, or windpipe, is rigid and has prominent rings. That's because your trachea is basically built like a vacuum hose. Since the lungs create negative pressure with every breath, the trachea needs those rings to keep it open. If it were soft and floppy, it would collapse every time the pressure dropped and you wouldn't be able to breathe. From there, the trachea splits in two, forming the right and left main bronchi. You can imagine these inner lung parts as sort of an upside-down tree. Now we are in the lung tissue and have entered what we call the respiratory zone. This is where the actual gas exchange occurs, and everything you find here has a form to suit that function. So the smaller branches of the upside-down tree are bronchioles, which taper down into progressively narrower tubes until they empty into the alveolar ducts, and then dead end into tiny alveolar sacs, where the bulk of the gas exchange finally occurs. Because that's where each sac contains a cluster of alveoli, these tiny cavities lined with super thin wet membranes made of simple squamous epithelium tissue. It's here that oxygen molecules dissolve in the wet mucus, diffuse across the epithelial cells, and then cross the single layer of endothelial cells lining the capillaries to enter the bloodstream. And of course, it's also where carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and then follows the same route back up to the nose and mouth where it's exhaled. So it's your alveoli where diffusion meets bulk flow, because while you're picking up oxygen and dispensing with CO2 one molecule at a time, you're doing it in enormous quantities at any given second. Both of your lungs contain about 700 million alveoli, which together provide an amazing 75 square meters of moist membrane surface area. So the principles that make respiration possible are relatively simple: diffusion and bulk flow. And so are the mechanisms in your body that use them. It just took us about 400 million years to figure out how to make it all work. But today you learned how it does work, including the mechanics of both simple diffusion and bulk flow, and the physiology of breathing, and the anatomy of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone of your respiratory system. Thank you to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for themselves and for everyone in the world for free with their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor was Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
So, yeah, a lot of working parts there. But it's what allows, like our cellular function by getting all of this, oxygen molecules exposed to our bloodstream so that we can carry it around. So as we're looking at this, we do have our respiratory passageways, right? Primarily, that's going to be like your bronchi, right? Like obviously there's your nasal cavities, and they have like really cool things in like mucous membranes and all that stuff. You get your pharynx and your larynx, that's allowing stuff to kind of move around. Your larynx, by the way, that's where you're like, it is sort of running behind your trachea. Trachea is there to, that stays open to allow oxygen to travel. And then your larynx is actually your vocal cords. You can see there, they basically vibrate back and forth. And that's sort of what makes us have, the tone of our voice and stuff. And then your thyroid actually lives on that little thing. But like when we're looking at it, the real main passageways that we want to spend our time looking at here are our bronchi, right? So your bronchi are these two primary splits that are kind of branching into our lungs there, right? So you've got your left and your right. That is your those are your primary bronchi. Okay, so like oxygen's going to travel down. Some of it's going to go over here. Some of it's going over here. Your right lung is actually just a little bit larger than your left lung. Fun fact. You know, and that's just because of the shape of our heart. You can see it's got a little dent in it where our heart would sit, like right here between the two, and the heart does kind of poke over to the left side, which takes up a little bit of space. So that's the primary bronchi. Those are the primary tubes in which oxygen is going to travel. And then what's going to happen is they're going to branch into these little itty bitty branches there that we call bronchioles. Okay. So just like yesterday, we had like arteries, and then they broke down and got smaller, and we called them arterioles. We had veins, we broke those down into smaller versions, we call those venules, right? Well, here we've got bronchi, which are the big tubes, and then they branch down into what we call bronchioles. Okay, so bronchi are the main passageways that divide into each lung. They get smaller and smaller into the bronchioles, and then eventually they become what are called an alveoli. So at the end of every one of these, what you're going to see are these little alveoli, right? And let's see if I can find a picture of that. So alveoli are itty bitty little, they kind of look like popcorn. They're little popcorn sacs at the end of our blood vessels here, right? Or at the end of our bronchioles here. And they are covered in blood vessels, right? So they're small little popcorn shaped sacs, and they are covered. Look at how these are absolutely covered in capillaries. And what's happening is like oxygen's traveling through this little tube right here, and it's going into this little hollow circle here, this little hollow chunk of the popcorn. And the walls between the alveoli and the walls between our blood vessels are so thin that oxygen can literally travel from one side to the other naturally, right? So again, we go back to the idea of something being thin enough. You know, we call it selectively permeable, right? It's got little holes in it because it's so thin, and anything small enough can fit through that hole. So if we got like a molecule of, let's say, nitrogen, right? So like a molecule of nitrogen looks like this, right? We'll put a little N in there to represent that it's nitrogen, right? This is not getting through the hole. Yeah, like thunk, thunk, you know, like it's not diffusing from one side to the other. But oxygen is really itty bitty, you know, and so that is actually one of the reasons why oxygen doesn't really have a hard time diffusing from one side to the other. So we'll say oxygen here. There are an absolute ton of oxygen molecules on this side of the wall, right? So this is in the bronchi, or I should say in the bronchioles, right? Particularly it's in the alveoli, the little popcorn shaped sacs, right? So this is outside of the bloodstream, right? This is not technically even in our body, right? Like this is that external environment that I was talking about. Now, over here on the inside of the body, you've got all of these red blood cells that right now are kind of bluish colored, right? You know, you've got all like, let me go like that, and then I'm gonna put a little thing in there. So you got all these like red blood cells over here, you know, that are carrying oxygen around and carrying CO2 around. But now that they're here in the lungs, right? Like there's not a lot of oxygen here in them right now. Right now, they're really just kind of packed full of CO2, right? So we're going to draw them in blue to kind of represent that that's like what's there, right? We represent that. That's sort of what shows us that this is like a CO2 rich blood currently, right? And an oxygen low. So over here, we see a ton of O2 molecules, right? Or O2. And over here, we're seeing a whole bunch of carbon dioxide, or CO2, right? So there we go. Like that's what we're primarily seeing in these areas, right? Now this is so this whole area is in the blood, right? So this is in the capillaries, right? Inside the bloodstream. So that's where all of this is taking place over here. So what we're seeing when we look at this chart is that like oxygen is going to move this way across the membrane over here, and CO2 is going to move across the membrane in exactly the opposite direction. It's going to go this way. And that's the exchange that we're talking about externally. So this, all of this, is an external gas exchange. So that's sort of what we're seeing here, right? So there's our external gas exchange. Oxygen driving into our red blood cells and carbon dioxide driving out of it. So that is all happening because these little bronchioles end in alveoli, they end in these little popcorn-shaped sacs, and then those alveoli are just straddled, covered with little capillary beds. And that is where the exposure is taking place. By the way, you ever want to see a really cool version of this at the bodies exhibit? I know I've mentioned this to you guys before, but like the bodies exhibit has a really cool bit on lungs, and you can kind of see like what all those individual branches are. Can't really see any alveoli in here because like those are literally so microscopic that like it would be impossible for human hands to like turn that into plastic or whatever. But like this is sort of what the inside of your lungs kind of look like. And then they got all the like classic like smoker's lung versus like a normal lung, which is kind of cool. But yeah, love the bodies exhibit. Got all kinds of really cool stuff there. So so those are sort of the tubes by which like all of this oxygen and air and all this gas is sort of traveling. Any questions on that, guys? Everybody feel pretty good about that? Questions, comments, concerns? We understand how this exchange is happening?
No.
Cool. Love that. So next thing we got to look at, let's go ahead and zoom out just a little bit. Let's get out of the microscopic stuff and just let's take a look at the lungs themselves. So one of the things that's cool about your lungs is that because it is in like your chest cavity, we don't exactly want, we want these sacs to be able to expand and contract easily, right? Like, remember, these are all covered in like they're sacs that are generating that area of like low pressure. We need that sac to be able to expand and contract, right? Like I need the lung to be flexible. That's one of the things that like that's one of the reasons why like smoking is so bad for us, is because like you are bringing in all of this like junk, right? Like you're bringing in like all these different chemicals that travel down smaller and smaller and smaller, and then they're filling these little things. You end up with all kinds of like fluid on the inside, and that's what like emphysema is. When you look at like emphysema from like smoking, basically what's happening is you are filling the lungs full of crap, right? Like you're filling the tubes full of like junk, and then it makes it oxygen unable to kind of get through what we're just going to call it mucus, right? So this mucus is covering the inside linings. Also, that causes like your body knows that that's not good. So unfortunately, your immune system tries to start attacking it. It doesn't do a very good job. It doesn't have the tools to like kill all of these chemicals. So that just causes like inflammation in the airways. So now it's inflamed and there's mucus, and oxygen can't travel very effectively. That creates like too much pressure, which ends up damaging the inside of your alveoli, right? So then like these walls are experiencing such massive pressure changes that it causes the walls to actually break down, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they completely pop. And then here's what that kind of looks like in the end. It's like here, this is a lot of surface area. That's a lot of exposure for like oxygen to transport into the bloodstream. Over here, this is less surface area. It may look the same, like these aren't different sizes, right? But like there's way more surface area because these are there's little walls running through the whole thing. That increased surface area helps so much, and so here we've lost a lot of surface area. We got this one big room instead of like several little small rooms, right? Like imagine painting the rooms of painting a house, right? If you had to paint a warehouse, right, like a big empty warehouse, it's just the frame. It's maybe bigger than your actual house is, and if you had to paint the inside walls, all you got is like back wall, front wall, left wall, right wall, ceiling, floor. right? 6 like little surfaces to paint. But now imagine if you had like 10 rooms in that warehouse, right? You'd have to paint all that stuff as, you know, the same, right? But then you'd also have to paint all 4 walls within each of those 10 rooms. That's more surface area. It's going to take way more cans of paint. We like having surface area because that's what exposes our blood. Our blood is able to cover, kind of like paint, more stuff and get exposed to more oxygen. So when we smoke, and it causes these pressure changes and it breaks down those walls, we lose that surface area. And without that surface area, we exchange less oxygen. That's why it feels so much harder to breathe if you have like a problem with smoking. One of the other problems is if your immune system does kind of grab some of those chemicals and stuff, it often produces like a lot of mucus. And this is where like we all probably know that smoker who has like what the chest rattle. My mom, you know, was a smoker for years. She quit as a graduation gift to me, but like the damage unfortunately had kind of been done by that point. But like, you know, she was a smoker for decades. And so she coughs a lot. And when she does, it sounds like rattly. It sounds like there's like something, you know, like it sounds like a spray paint can, you know, like in the inside of her lungs. And like what that is that's like fluid basically flapping on like these little holes here, right? So you have what's called pleura. Pleura is connective tissue that covers your lungs, right? And so I actually can't, I don't know if I can get a picture of the pleura here. Lung pleura. So it's this like lining that kind of covers your lungs there and make sure that it doesn't get like stuck to any of the other materials inside of your body, because again, we want those sacs to be able to expand easily. So this pleural lining here can get like inflamed and it can get infections and you can get like fluid in there. And like when that happens, that makes it much harder to breathe. That's what pleurisy is called. It is, right? It's essentially inflammation of that pleural lining. Okay, so that's the respiratory passageways, right? That's where all the air is going to travel. But how do we actually pump air in? Well, that's where the respiratory pump comes in, right? So you have your diaphragm. This is the main muscle that is responsible for respiratory pumping, right? So if we're looking at like this whole process of like ventilation, we've got to look at the diaphragm. It is this dome-shaped muscle. I'm going to go back to the picture of it here. It's this dome-shaped muscle that lives underneath our lungs, that's attached to our lungs, right? And when the diaphragm contracts, it contracts down like this. So by contracting down, what that does is it opens up the sac. It kind of drags the lungs open. Like, you know, imagine what is actually, you know what is that inflatable do that scoop thing. Yeah, these things here. What the heck is this called? But you'll see people like inflate this stuff. Let me find a video of it. Because these like little pouch, yeah, pouch couch. I guess this is the same thing. This is really cool. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I kind of wanted to get one of these for a long time, and I was like, that's how your lungs work. So he's literally just going to kind of open it up and it just drives air in there, right? How amazing is that? That's so cool. What he's doing is like, there is less pressure, at least right now, there's less pressure in this sac than there is here in the atmosphere. So what that does is it just passively drives air into the little couch. And then eventually it kind of fills up and then he's going to seal it, kind of wrap it down. And, you know, then he can lay down and kind of relax on it, right? Like, and it's super lightweight and easy to bring. I don't know why you wouldn't use a hammock, you know, like, which is a little easier to set up. But that is a really good example of like how your diaphragm works. Your diaphragm contracts down. And when it does that, it creates an area of low pressure. And so like what's going to naturally happen is oxygen is going to rush straight in to the lungs, right? And then that oxygen is going to be exposed to the bloodstream because, you know, it's covered in capillaries and things like that. So it's this dome-shaped muscle that contracts. And when I say it's dome-shaped, this is its relaxed state. It normally sits like this when it's relaxing. So when it contracts, it pulls down like this. And that drags the lung open, similar to how we saw on the couch there, creating this atmosphere where air is going to go rushing in. So that's ventilation. So ventilation is going to be, you know, sort of a two-step process. There's inhalation, which is driving, you know, the active phase of like contracting your diaphragm down. You know, we breathe by, you know, drawing air into the lungs. The diaphragm goes from being a dome to flattening down like this. And that creates like the low pressures that air comes in. Then we've got exhalation, which is actually the passive part of breathing, where your diaphragm relaxes back to normal. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait. Breathing in is active and breathing out is passive. What about like birthday candles, right? Because clearly I can go, you know, which is a very active thing to do. Yes, absolutely, right? That is a very active thing to do, but you're actually using secondary helper respiratory muscles. When we talk about like just normal process of breathing, like if you were unconscious, like let's say you're taking a nap or something, right? Like you are going to actively contract your diaphragm down, and then the weight of your chest and your muscles, and then the diaphragm just relaxing, is going to sort of push that air out of your lungs. So it is the breathing out that is passive. It is the breathing in that is actually active. That is the contraction that takes place, right? So we contract our diaphragm down, that creates the low pressure that drives air into our lungs. We relax our diaphragm back up, that creates an area of high pressure, which pushes air out of our lungs. And then there are all kinds of like little intercostal muscles, some that go this way, some that go this way, creating sort of an X that are working, to also do that. Sorry, I just disconnected my monitor for a second. That are also responsible for that as well. So here we're seeing, right, the sort of relationship between like atmosphere and like pressure, right? Like as we sort of blow into a balloon, right, there are more and more and more molecules inside this balloon until eventually like the pressure in here is greater than the pressure out here. And it's certainly greater than the pressure inside of our lungs, which is why the balloon always wants to sort of go back into our lungs there. So as the volume of a container increases, right, so does its pressure, which naturally wants to move it to wherever the lowest area of pressure is. And that's why, you know, it's very natural and very passive for our lungs to be pushing down, limiting the volume and allowing gas to escape. Yeah, questions on that, guys? Everybody feel good?
Feeling good.
Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how we sort of like measure breathing. These are probably not all of these terms are going to be very, you know, commonly tested. But the big one that you probably pay attention to is what's called your tidal volume. And so it's kind of like the tide, honestly. That's where it sort of gets its name from. So this is the amount of air moved into and out of your lungs during normal, relaxed, quiet breathing. You guys are all you're all using your tidal volume right now, right? So when we look at the volume here, you can see this is sort of what this looks like, right? So your tidal volume is like how much air you're driving in. Remember, air is just atmosphere. It's not just oxygen molecules. We're just talking about the amount of gas coming into your lungs and the amount of gas coming out. So when you're normally breathing, just like right now, it's not crazy. It's just little tiny volume. Now, there is like more that you can bring in, right? Obviously, like I could take a normal breath in and I've got all this extra space to go even further, right? That is what is known as our inspiratory reserve volume, okay? So the inspiratory reserve volume is the additional amount that can be breathed in after a normal breath in, right? So I take a normal breath in, it ends here, but then I got all this extra space that I can keep breathing in. Well, what if I take a normal breath out, right? Well, that would take me to here, but what about like if I go beyond that, right? Well, that's what's called your expiratory reserve volume. So you got your inspiratory reserve, you get your expiratory reserve. Now, if you were to go from inspiratory reserve, like big deep breath in, to the biggest breath out possible, right? The biggest in versus the biggest out, that is what's going to be called your vital capacity, right? You're sprinting up a mountain, you're like, you know, like big breaths in, big breaths out. That's your vital capacity. And what's kind of fun is you can never really get rid of some of the residual volume. There is just a little bit of volume always left in your lungs there. Kind of like let's say you take a paper sack and you crumple it up, right? But you just casually crumple it up. There's still space left in that sack. You know, most of it's gone, but like you squeeze really hard, it goes away. You squeeze even harder, maybe it even goes further away. That little bit of like squeezing even harder and harder, that is what we call your residual volume. And that, or your residual capacity sometimes. That's what makes up your total lung capacity. By the way, you do not want to tap into your residual capacity. If you do, you've probably collapsed a lung, which is not awesome, because you're going to need to have a doctor go in there and reinflate the darn thing. And it's going to hurt. But that's sort of our different volume. The one, honestly, guys, they'll probably, if you ever get asked a question, and honestly, they don't ask this question very often, but if you ever do get a question about lung volumes, they just want you to know that it'll be the tidal volume. That's the common ones. The amount of air coming in during a normal breath in and a normal breath out, kind of like the tide, right? Like whoosh, and out, in and out, you know, like, so we are almost all the way through our process of respiration, right? So now we've sort of looked at, you know, we've created the external gas exchange. We have officially like done this part where oxygen is going to go into the blood and CO2 is going to go out of the blood, right? And it's going to take all these red blood cells, which are currently, you know, full of carbon dioxide. We're drawing them in blue, right? It's going to take all these red blood cells and it's going to turn them a bright, bright, bright red color. So gas exchange requires some type of a pressure gradient, but it also requires a concentration gradient, right? Two types of gradients. Again, nature does not like gradients. It does not like a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over there. That's why pressure moves the way it does, right? When there's a lot of pressure here and very little pressure over there, it naturally moves down the gradient from areas of high to areas of low. So external gas exchange requires this, right? The reason the oxygen is leaving the alveoli and going into the capillaries, the reason the oxygen is going from here to here is because there's a lot of oxygen over here and very little over here. So it naturally wants to move down the gradient. The reason carbon dioxide moves from here over to here is because it wants to move down the gradient, right? So during the gas exchange, externally, oxygen leaves and goes into the blood. CO2 leaves the blood and goes into the lungs, and that way we can press the lungs and push that air out. Internal gas exchange is exactly the opposite. So we're going to go ahead and just like remake our chart here and do practically the same thing. Only this time we are seeing, like, we're going to divide this into two sides here. And all of our little red blood cells are actually red now. So we draw like a little red blood cell here. Let's make a couple more. So now they are oxygen-rich red blood cells because they just got back from the lungs, right? They just got done doing this. So whoop, and whoop. And I'll just make a couple copies of this. Whoops. So we'll put those there. We'll put those there. All right, so now we've got all of this like O2 rich blood. And we've got all of this like, you know, body's tissues. I'm just going to go ahead and maybe we'll just draw like a couple tissues here. We're going to put these in blue. I just realized I probably should have. Hold on. Let's rotate that. So here's our body tissue over here, right? Put that end there. So here's all of our various tissues, right? Now this is very CO2 rich, right? This is carbon dioxide or CO2 rich tissue. Right, so now there's just a lot of tissue over here that has already used up all of its oxygen, and it needs to get rid of CO2 molecules. So what's going to happen is oxygen is going to naturally want to move down the gradient, right? It's going to naturally want to go from areas of, where it is very rich and get out of there. It's going to want to go this way, right? Meanwhile, carbon dioxide, CO2, is going to want to go into our red blood cells. So that's going to want to go this way. And that's the exchange that we are seeing, right? So this is an internal gas exchange because this is happening at the body tissue level, right? So we are describing here external gas exchange. So there we go. We see like we've got our external stuff. I wrote external again. Good Lord. Internal gas exchange. My apologies. My brain loves a pattern and it loves to get stuck on them. So that's sort of like how this is all happening constantly. So now all we have to do is transport that blood around from place to place to place. And so gas transport is going to happen thanks to your cardiovascular system. It's going to push that stuff around through blood vessels powered by the heart. So here it is, right? So nature hates gradients, so it will naturally move oxygen or other gases down their concentration gradients to areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So you can see here in the lungs, oxygen goes into the red blood cell and CO2 leaves it. Meanwhile, at the body tissues, the exact opposite happens, right? Oxygen goes in and CO2 comes out. So they did their chart a little like sort of in the, I kept mine in the same direction, moving oxygen from left to right, but you can see they kind of flip it here. But it's, the directions are not really important. It just matters like, or how they're drawn isn't important. It just matters like where oxygen's going from high to low concentrations there. And that little carbon, by the way, there's like what a CO2 molecule looks like. That's the carbohydrates, that's the fats, that's the proteins, that's the byproduct of using those as energy production. That's what we need to get out of the body. That's the waste product. It's like we took carbon, we took carbohydrates, we split it apart, created a bunch of energy, all the leftovers, we just got to exhale that out. So that is sort of how that happens. Now, obviously, like I said, this does have to actually transport throughout the body. So gas transport is going to describe how we are actually moving all of this stuff around. So why is oxygen going into our red blood cells in particular? Like, why doesn't it just go directly, into like a tissue, right? Like we could just have tubes that kind of run directly throughout our body, exposing everything to air and atmosphere, right? Wouldn't that keep our tissues alive? Actually, that is how insects do it, right? Insects, they actually bring air pretty much passively through their exoskeleton. Oof. So like, what they do is like, they just kind of passively breathe it in through their skin. Certain amphibians do the same thing. Amphibians can do that because like they can have like a little wet membrane. That's actually why a lot of them like live in swamps and things like that. That makes it easy for, air to kind of passively just kind of pass through their skin and oxygenate things. But insects are very small, and that is exactly why. So let's see here. Composition of air during prehistoric era. So before like the whole world went into like, before the whole world like changed drastically, like when there were like dinosaurs and stuff around, the composition of air was very different. There was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. And that is one of the reasons why it actually made it way easier for us to have these like giant, massive creatures, right? It was easier for them to breathe. A dinosaur would never, this is one of the things that unfortunately ruins Jurassic Park, is that like a creature that size really couldn't exist because it basically wouldn't be able to breathe. It just like wouldn't be able to handle like pressure would just like not drive enough oxygen to where it needs to go because there's just not a high enough concentration. And this is also why if we look at like prehistoric insect size, insects used to be massive. Like, you know, there used to be freaking dragonflies the size of this lady's body, right? There used to be like these giant freaking pteropods, millipedes and stuff, you know, all of these like massively freaky creatures back in the day. So like the atmosphere changed and like those creatures that size kind of died off because they were breathing passively through their exoskeleton. That's great if there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, but it doesn't really work very well nowadays. There's the biggest insect on the planet is this little guy right here, this like freaking New Zealand cricket that's still around. I don't know how the freaking thing survives, you know, like, but it's terrifying. That's a Weta, by the way. If anybody here is like a Lord of the Rings fan, Peter Jackson, Weta Digital, he named it after those giant crickets. So oxygen's naturally going to move, but why in particular, why do we have to have like red blood cells? Why can't we just passively move oxygen throughout like our entire body? Well, the red blood cell has a molecule of iron at its center. It has this protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a special protein that's going to be found in our red blood cells that contain molecules of iron. And so when we look at like how, you know, iron and oxygen, they get along really, really well. So like I have a bunch of, you know, I have like a home workout gym, right, outside, and the plates that I have out there, the metal plates, unfortunately, like they rust a little bit, you know, there's a little bit of rust on them. And what that is that's, you know, the water is sort of like kicking off this chemical reaction, making it happen faster, but it's oxidizing the iron. So when we look at like iron as an element, it looks like this naturally. You know, it's this kind of like steelish, you know, kind of, you know, gray color, right? But if you look at like oxidized iron, it looks like this. It turns like a bright red color. This is why our red blood cells are red. Now, when you look at this, you see like a little bit of green in there. What the heck is that? Well, that's actually coming from like copper. When we look at like oxidized copper, it looks like this. It turns like this color. That's why the Statue of Liberty is actually supposed to be copper color. That's what the original Statue of Liberty actually looked like. It looked like a freaking penny, right? But now it's kind of this bluish color because it's been exposed to so much like oxygen and, you know, things like that. So when iron binds to oxygen, it turns this bright red color. That's what gives our red blood cells their red appearance. Iron and oxygen get along really, really, really well. So when you have like a red blood cell that has little proteins called hemoglobin that have iron at their center, right? If we look at hemoglobin, it looks like this, by the way. Oop. 4 little proteins there with 1 molecule of iron at each of their centers. So they're able to attract lots and lots and lots and lots of little O2 molecules until eventually it gets to a place where like, okay, now the concentration of O2 inside the red blood cell is pretty much the same as the atmosphere around it. Now it doesn't really have any more reasons to actually move, right? So now that red blood cell is oxidized, so you know what it can do? It can work its way out of the lungs, travel over to my body's tissue and drop that oxygen off. Now, why the heck does oxygen leave the red blood cell? It loves being attracted to iron so much, and the iron is found in my red blood cell. Why is it going to move out of the red blood cell into my muscle? Well, my muscles have what is called myoglobin, which is very similar to hemoglobin, except that it's like found within my muscles. And so it is attracted to oxygen. And oxygen is present in the red blood cell where there's a lot of it. And it's not very present in my myoglobin because I just got done doing a repetition. So now it's a low oxygen environment. And so again, nature is going to move it naturally from one spot to another. The exact opposite, carbon dioxide is also relatively attracted to iron because obviously carbon dioxide has plenty of oxygen in it. So it is also going to work its way there, but not all the carbon dioxide gets attached directly to your red blood cells. Some of it's dissolved in the fluid, in the plasma. This is why exercise raises your pH, is because like by adding carbon dioxide into your blood, you are becoming a little more acidic. Some of it is going to dissolve into like body fluids, and the rest of it is going to be like carried back to the lungs so that we can exhale it. Now, all of this breathing stuff is under the control of our nervous system. Again, we've been talking about the nervous system being the king of all these systems ever since we introduced it, right? So your central nervous system is autonomically controlling your breathing rate. Now, you do have some somatic control, right? Like I can go on purpose and breathe in, right? So that's very somatic, but like autonomically, like if I just hold my breath long enough, eventually I'm going to have a massive breath in. I don't really have any control over that. It will autonomically do that. Or if I sleep, right, I'm autonomically sort of controlling my breathing. So it is controlled by your central nervous system, and it's modified by specific receptors that are responding to your blood's chemistry. So when your blood gets really acidic, your breathing rate increases in order to drive in greater amounts of oxygen. So that is what is known as your VO2, your volume of oxygen consumed. So your brain is going to kind of communicate with these little receptors that are like, oh, God, blood is absolutely acidic right now. We need more oxygen in here so we can get rid of this and get this back to neutral, right? And that is what controls your breathing rate. This is also why you don't always like catch your breath right in the beginning. You know, when you start going for a jog, you start exercising in the beginning, like you kind of feel like, you're like, oh God, I feel a little sludgy at first, like the first 5 minutes. And then finally you're like, okay, well now I can just kind of jog passively for the next few minutes, right? You get that like, goo in your mouth, that first initial like, I always have to do every time I play Ultimate. Like I go do my first couple warm-up points, and then like I have to go off to the side and got to get that out of there, right? That is sort of, it does take some time. Unfortunately, your lactic acid production sort of outpaces it at first because your body didn't know it was going to start exercising, and this is again one more reason why we like to warm up. So this is all from like a lot of different like chemical changes there. So as your muscles do exercise, and it's actually, fun fact, it's those chemical readers, those little receptors, they live on your aortic arch there, which is the first place that blood gets pumped out when your heart squeezes. So it's a pretty good spot for it. Now there are versions of like abnormal breathing. We do have like hyperventilation or hypoventilation. Hypoventilation, unfortunately, is like where there's just not enough air coming into the alveoli. If you're a smoker, that's often hypoventilation. It's like you may be breathing like this, but the amount of air actually getting in there is limited. So that's hypoventilation, which decreases your blood's pH, which is not great, right? And then there's actually hyperventilation. Anybody in here ever had a panic attack? Have you ever had like hyperventilating where you just feel like you can't breathe? So you're just like, what's interesting about panic attacks is that it is actually not a problem with having it feels like you're not getting enough oxygen. It feels like you can't breathe and there's not enough air in the world for you, Ironically, that's actually not what's happening. What's weird is you have plenty of air. Arguably, you have too much air. And you don't have enough CO2, which seems really weird to say because CO2 is the waste product that we're trying to always get rid of. But in this case, we actually need CO2 because we need a gradient. The amount of air present in your body and the amount of CO2, it all sort of got to the same place it is in the atmosphere. So now oxygen is just happy. It has no reason to move. So weirdly, when you're hyperventilating, what you need is more CO2 reintroduced back into your body. And so the way to do that is you breathe into a paper sac or a sac of some type, right? The CO2 that you do exhale goes out, gets trapped in the sac, and then you re-inhale it until eventually the levels get to a gradient, and then stuff will start moving again, and you'll be able to feel like you can breathe. So that's, if you're ever having a panic attack, that's one of the best things you can do. It sounds crazy, but even holding your breath can, which by the way, good luck. That is going to feel impossible at the time, because this is a very panicky, scary situation to be in. But the best thing you can do is just breathe into a sac and reintroduce all of that CO2 back into your lungs enough times until your levels get better, and then you'll feel like you're breathing totally normal. And that can happen from really shallow breathing patterns. Like when we get stressed out, we tend to breathe like this, right? Rather than like taking big deep breaths in. That exhales CO2 faster than it brings in oxygen if you breathe like that. All of us can induce a panic attack if we just did that long enough. Don't do that. So yeah, so that is the respiration part of things. How you guys feeling?
Feeling good.
Good.
Good, sir.
All right, let's put it together, right? Unfortunately, we have to put it together on the same day that we introduced it. We didn't have to do that with the muscles and stuff. You know, when we did like the nervous system and the muscular system and stuff, we just kind of naturally did it the next day and sort of capped it all together. Today, we got to put the NASM slides together on the same day that we introduced half of it. But luckily, it's a very short PowerPoint. A lot of it is review because we just went over it, and we went over it yesterday as well. But again, whenever we get to these NASM chapters, and this is chapter 3, let's see here. I believe that they combined them in this one. I want to make sure I'm right though, because I could be wrong. Where's that chapter list? Killing me, small. Nervous, skeletal, muscular. No, it's not. So chapter 6. That's right. It puts it with, they combined digestive system and the cardio stuff. That's, so they did combine some chapters here. So for those of you who with the 7th edition textbook, you're going to read the first half of chapter 7. For those of you with the 6th edition, that's going to be chapter 3. So 7th edition students, so that should really, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's only Danny, Simon, Julio, and Cyrus. Chris and Dion, you guys are going to read. It's the one with the girl doing like the push-up. This one right here. That's chapter 3 of this book. For those of you at the 7th edition, it's going to be this one. It's chapter 5. Okay. But only the first half of chapter 5. Reorganizing all my stuff. So let's go ahead and take a look at the cardiorespiratory system here. So your cardiorespiratory system is a support system, meaning that, like, you know, if your human movement system is in charge, your kinetic chain is in charge of like human movement, it is supported by the cardiorespiratory system. So when I say cardiorespiratory, I mean your vascular system working together with your respiratory system. So we're putting them together. And that describes how we extract oxygen from the environment and deliver it, sort of all as one big job. So it is a support system supplying human tissue with oxygen, with nutrients, protective agents like, you know, your white blood cells and stuff, and a means by which we can remove waste products. It is the cardiovascular plus respiratory systems. So we'll look at the cardiovascular system first. We'll look at the respiratory system second, and we'll look at the cardiorespiratory system as a whole first, and then we'll break those two parts down individually. And then we'll explain how each of those systems is actually related to allowing us to do the human movement stuff. So when I say cardiorespiratory system, like I said, we are sort of talking about all of this coming together. The cardiovascular system, that's your heart, it's your blood vessels. The respiratory system It's your respiratory pump, like your diaphragm, and your respiratory passageways, like your bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. So together, those two systems work to supply all of the muscle and neurons and even bones with the oxygen and nutrients that they need in order to survive. So looking at the cardiovascular system first, we'll go ahead and start things off. Like I said, it's the heart, blood, and blood vessels. We'll start things off with the heart, right? So your heart is that muscular pump that contracts because it is made of heart muscle, right? In order to push blood throughout the body via blood vessels, right? So it is comprised of cardiac muscle fibers, which are slightly different than like skeletal muscle fibers. They contract very rhythmically. They sort of have a built-in rhythm to them, which is about 70 to 80 beats per minute for the average person. It's usually about like, for men, it's usually about like 70. For women, it's closer to like 75, maybe 80. The reason that's different is just body size. You know, men have a larger heart, so just it can beat a little bit less often. And then there's a whole bunch of specialized structures within the heart that actually allow those conductions to take place. So they do have that built-in rhythm thanks to specialized nodes, right? You have your sinoatrial node. It's your SA node. That's the pacemaker of the heart. This is actually what sets your heart's rhythm. Now, it is under the control of your nervous system, right? If we look at this, right, this is the SA node right here. But it is, you know, there are wires that go straight up to our brain, and that is under the control of our actual nervous system. So what will happen is this will initiate like a signal, however fast it's supposed to go, thanks to the nervous system telling it. It'll run across the top of the heart, and it'll finish contracting here first because that signal will travel down. And now there's the AV node here. That's your atrioventricular node. And it will pause the signal for just a second. So this creates the signal, and then it runs at the same time down all this, right? But once it gets here, it gets delayed and stops running any further. Whereas this will finish up. Now, once that's done, it will then finish the signal down here to what is called your bundle of His. And then that will branch out into all of what are called your Purkinje fibers. And that's actually what allows all of the contraction to take place. So you have your SA node, internodal pathways, AV node, and then you have your bundle of His and Purkinje fibers. So it starts in the SA node. That's the big one that we want to know. Okay, it is just the pacemaker that's setting your rhythm. Just like we talked about moments ago, when your heart gets more acidic, your respiratory rate increases. Well, when your blood gets more acidic, your heart also increases. All of that is under the control of the autonomic portions of our nervous system. So your heart, like we talked about yesterday, is comprised of 4 chambers here. You're going to have 2 atriums on either side. An atrium is gathering blood as it returns back to the heart. So some of that blood's returning to the heart from the body, and some of that blood's returning to the heart from the lungs, right? So it gets gathered up in the top chambers, right and left atriums, and then drops into the 2 lower chambers that are your ventricles. You've got your right ventricle over here, and that's going to contract in a moment. Then you get your left ventricle over here, and that's going to contract in a moment. So the atriums gathered the blood, and the ventricles are going to squeeze that blood out of the heart. So the right ventricle is going to pump it over to the lungs. The left ventricle is going to pump it out through the entire body. And that's why the left ventricle is so much more muscular, because if it's going throughout the entire body, you know, that's a pretty big distance to have to cover. You know, I got to get blood from here over to my lungs using my right ventricle. I got to get blood from here down to my right pinky toe, not close, right, using my left ventricle. So that's why, like, you can see these blood vessels are even a little thinner than this huge hunkin' blood vessel here called your aorta. That's like the first contraction, like right as it comes out, you know, pressure is highest right here. So those are your atriums and those are your ventricles, right? And that is constantly just pushing blood to wherever it needs to go, traveling through your blood vessels. So obviously, we want to make sure that this muscular pump is working the way it's supposed to, right? We want to make sure that this is pushing blood all around in the directions we want it to go effectively, right? So the way that we measure the function of the heart is we're going to pay attention to 2 major things. We're going to pay attention to the stroke volume, which is the volume of blood pushed through the heart every time your heart beats, and your heart rate, Your heart rate is how often your heart beats. So those two things make up the product of how effectively your heart is pushing lots of oxygen to wherever it needs to go. So if I can push a lot of blood out of my heart every time my heart beats, because maybe my heart's really strong, like, and it just goes flying out of there, right? If I can do that, that means that I have a very, very strong heart, right? So now the number of times that my heart has to beat is less. It's like, no, I got that done in 10 pumps, like that's a way more efficient heart. So we call this concept cardiac output. It's the overall performance of our heart, and it's how much blood is pumped out of the heart per minute. So if I pump 10 units of blood every time and I beat 100 times, that is 1,000 units of blood delivered, right? So stroke volume is the amount. Heart rate is the speed at which this happens. So we're constantly paying attention to our client's heart rate, because we know if it's racing, right, if it's going like way faster than it should be, that shows us that like that heart's not really pumping very much blood every time it beats. We have a weak heart in this situation, which means we should probably prioritize a cardiovascular program for our client, right? So you want to continually measure heart rate. We also want to give our clients like target heart rates, because like it's also a very good indicator of how hard someone is working. So like if you use like the Karvanen formula, which is this calculator that I taught a little while back, right? So you go to this like Karvanen calculator here. Let's say like I'm 33 years old, resting heart, let's just say it's like 57 beats per minute. Hit calculate here, right? If I go down here, let's say I want to do like an endurance cardio workout where like I can go kind of at one consistent pace for maybe 30 straight minutes, right? Well, about 65 to maybe 75% of my max heart rate is going to be the perfect range there. If I go beyond 75, I'm going to start to get out of breath. If I go below 65, I'm not really doing cardio. So like I would say if I was wearing a heart rate monitor, hey, I want to be somewhere between 142 beats per minute and 155 beats per minute. Now, if I were not in as good a shape, then my heart rate's obviously going to be much higher. Let's say my resting heart rate is like 80 beats per minute, right? And I hit calculate again. Well, now that 65% is going to be like 150, and that 75% is going to be 160, because my heart's going to have to beat a little bit faster in order to get the same amount of work done as the first scenario. So that's one of the reasons why we pay attention to target heart rates. And you can monitor this directly, like while you're exercising, just count the number of beats in like 6 seconds and then just add a 0. You're on the treadmill, you go, get to the 5-minute marker, wait for it to get to a 0, and then you're like, count it for 6 seconds, and then just add a 0 to your number. And there you go. So if it beats 17 times, that's 170 beats per minute that you're currently experiencing. That is a little bit higher than I want it to be. So chances are I'm going to be out of breath pretty soon here, because I'm, above that 75%. Could be what I'm going for. If I'm trying to like increase my cardiorespiratory, like, capacity, then great. I want to be at a high percentage, It's going to be a little bit different for everybody depending on their goals. This is why NASM has different cardiovascular zones, depending on what your client's goal and what their training is. Danny and Cyrus, I haven't talked about those target heart rate zones, but trust me, they're coming down the pipe later. So that is how we're going to sort of approach that when we look at like the heart's function, right? We're looking at cardiac output. Now, obviously, we can't talk about the cardiovascular system without talking about blood. Blood is delivering all of these nutrients that we've been talking about, right? And so this is acting as like the actual medium by which we move the stuff around. Like, again, blood is comprised of like mostly water, but a good chunk of it is red blood cells. And red blood cells, the reason they are red is because, again, they have that molecule of hemoglobin, which is a molecule of iron in it. And so that attracts oxygen molecules, turning it a bright red color. So these transport oxygen, they transport hormones, nutrients, and CO2, which is a waste product, out of the body. So red blood cells have this specialized protein in them called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is what binds to oxygen to actually transport that gas. But that blood has to have like a way to get exposed to the tissues. So we also have all of our different blood vessels, our vascular system here, which is a closed circuit of tubes that allow that allow blood to sort of travel throughout the body and get exposed to these tissues. So some of it's going to be in our lungs. You can see here, these are kind of branching out to the right and left lungs over here. Some of it goes up to our head. No, you are covered in blood vessels. You know, if we look at you know, here's another example, the body's exhibit here. You are packed full of blood vessels, head to toe, absolutely covered, you know? And honestly, this is not all of them. Like so many of them are so microscopically small, like obviously like this exhibit would not be able to like show all of them, but you are covered in these blood vessels. There's a heart, that's a cool one. And so that is actually where, you know, again, oxygen is being, or blood is being exposed to our tissues so that CO2 and oxygen can be exchanged. So we've got two major categories of blood vessels, and then we got the one that's in the middle. So our two major categories are going to be arteries that are carrying blood away from the heart. We got veins carrying blood towards the heart, and we got our capillaries, which are sort of the middle section where the actual exchange side is happening. So an artery is going to be way too big to sort of work with like a tissue. So an artery branches down smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually we call it an arteriole. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it becomes this microscopic, really, 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 really small blood vessel called a capillary. And capillaries need to be very small. They need to have super thin walls so that oxygen can literally move from one side to the other. So we look at like, the sort of size of arteries, capillaries, and veins here. That's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the cross section. Oh, actually that'll work. I just found it. Oh, there it is. So they're very tiny. Look at this. Like, look at how thick this wall is, right? Compared to a vein. Compared to this, and this is 18 millimeters, this is 30 millimeters, this is 5 micrometers. Which there are 1,000 micrometers inside of 1 millimeter. So that means that this vein here, which is 30 millimeters across, would be 6,000 times larger, if my math is correct, which, good Lord, maybe you know, who knows if it is. 30 millimeters. Nope. Yeah, 30,000 divided by 5. Yeah, I did it. Sorry, that was just for me, guys. So there's our blood vessels, right? Capillaries, real tiny. So then we've got all of this, you know, cardiovascular stuff working with our respiratory stuff. And that's where we've got our respiratory system here, right? It working very intimately with the cardiovascular system. This is providing a means by which to gather oxygen from the environment so that then the cardiovascular system can transport it to the various tissues throughout the body. So we're going to divide the respiratory system into two divisions. We're going to have our respiratory pump, which is actually doing all the like pressure changes, and the respiratory passageways, which are allowing oxygen to get exposed to where it needs to go. So the respiratory pump is going to be the framework and flexibility that allows for ventilation. Remember, ventilation is just breathing, right? That's gas, not oxygen necessarily, gas being like nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, argon, neon, all these like elements in the air, right? It's just the ventilation is bringing air into the lungs. So respiration is bringing oxygen into the blood. So, you know, your respiratory pump ventilates. It either has like the inhalation or the exhalation. It is driving air in or driving air out. So it's got bones like your sternum, ribs, and vertebrae. That's going to protect it, but also it's kind of heavy. So it naturally sort of compresses down and makes the breathing out a very passive phase. Meanwhile, inspiration, drawing air in, is a very active phase that takes specific muscles like your diaphragm, your intercostals, your scalenes in your neck, your sternocleidomastoid in your neck, and even your pectoralis muscle, you know, which is in charge of like, you know, chest flies and things like that, protraction of the shoulder, things like that. It actually helps with breathing a little bit. And so like when those muscles contract, it helps. Now I will say the scalenes, sternocleidomastoid, and pec minor, for those of you who have been through kinesiology, you know that those are also very often bad guy muscles on our tight muscles list. And that is where these helper breathing muscles start to take over for breathing. Now we have dysfunctional breathing. Which is not great. So we actually really want to primarily rely on the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. That is where most of our breathing should occur. If we're using those other ones a little bit too much, it's going to have effects on our posture, which is why you sometimes see those people with like sort of a hunchback posture there, and they often have like breathing problems and tension headaches and all kinds of things like that. So that's the respiratory pump. It's located in the thoracic cavity, and it compresses and extends and allows ventilation to occur. Bones are going to be nice and heavy to allow that, but the muscles are doing really the heavy lifting of contraction, creating that area of low pressure, with the diaphragm being the king of all that. When the diaphragm flattens down, big change in pressure. And then we got all of our respiratory passageways, which are, you know, the nasal passageways, the oral passageways, the larynx and trachea here. And the trachea, by the way, like we want that to remain open, which is why it's got a little cartilage that kind of keeps it open there. And then that branches into our two sort of primary bronchi, gets even smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it becomes our bronchioles. So the passageways that actually funnel air into and out of our lungs, those are your respiratory passageways, right? The big ones are going to be the bronchi, then turn into bronchioles. Eventually, the bronchioles will end in little alveoli, right? Those little popcorn-shaped sacs. Those are going to be covered in those little capillaries we talked about earlier. This is where the exchange of oxygen and nutrients actually takes place. All right, so let's take a look here at like actually training it, right? So let's zoom out of the anatomy and let's take a little bit more of a deeper look at function here. So when your cardiorespiratory system is working, it is the cardiovascular system and respiratory systems working to deliver all this oxygen, right? So the respiratory system gathers the oxygen, the cardiovascular system delivers it, and the average rate at which we do this is about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight every 1 minute. Now that doesn't sound very helpful. But we call that a MET. That's what is known as metabolic equivalent. So when we look at like METs, a MET, like I said, when you are completely at rest, when you're asleep, you are consuming, when it comes to the amount of oxygen it takes to keep your body alive, about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. So the bigger your body weight, obviously the more oxygen you're going to be consuming, and the more physical activity you do, the more you are going to be consuming. So when you are playing like volleyball, you're at about 3 METs. You're consuming about 3 times the amount of oxygen that you would be if you were like sitting at home, you know, asleep, right? Or let's say you're playing golf, right? You're consuming about 4.5 times as much oxygen as you would be, right? Dancing, backpacking, basketball. If you're playing like competitive soccer, you're consuming like 10 times. the amount of oxygen that you would be consuming. So you can see this is going to burn a different number of calories per hour, right? So like volleyball is going to burn about 90 to 113 calories per hour, whereas soccer is going to burn somewhere between 300 and 375 calories per hour. The reason why is because this consumes more oxygen. It needs more energy, right? Or actually, I should say like this takes more energy, which in turn consumes more oxygen. Now, that's not super helpful because monitoring consumption is pretty difficult while you're in the gym. So it's helpful to use like as an example to explain to your clients why exercise burns so many calories. But it's not exactly like the most applicable like during a workout. This is why instead we tend to pay more attention to what I was showing you earlier, which is that percentage of max heart rate. You know, we break things down into zones, zone 1, zone 2, or zone 3. Zone 3 is a sprint, zone 2 is like a run, and zone 1 is like a walk or a jog, you know. So whenever we're talking about all of this, if we're ensuring proper functioning of the cardiorespiratory system, we also want to make sure that like we don't have any dysfunctional breathing patterns, right? So earlier I mentioned that you know, you can use those secondary respiratory muscles. They are meant to be secondary, right? They're not meant to be the primary breathers. So if you are using those to do most of your breathing, that is going to lead to some type of dysfunction. It's going to lead to really shallow breaths. It's going to lead to postural distortions, right? If I breathe like this, right, I'm using my trap muscles, which is kind of moving my lungs around a little bit, not very effectively, but like, you know, now all of this is tightening up because this is also a posture muscle. So now my improper breathing is affecting my posture. And now if I have really bad posture, guess what that's going to do? It's going to affect my breathing. So like, it's a really vicious cycle here. And that's why like sometimes it can lead to like tension during the workouts. It can lead to headaches, particularly like back of the head headaches, lightheadedness, dizziness, problems like that. So a lot of times the abdominals, sternocleidomastoid, these secondary respiratory muscles get used, which is one of the reasons why when we look at our postural distortions, you know, one of the things we assess for is someone's posture. And if we see that like, you know, they have a posture where their arms are falling forward because maybe they have tight muscles under the arms, I'm also going to assume they probably have some pretty dysfunctional breathing. Or if we look at like a push-pull, and we see like a client whose head like juts forward way more than it's supposed to, or the elevated shoulders there, or like if they have a low back arch, that's going to show me that they probably have some dysfunctional breathing. So we're going to work on like fixing that form by loosening up their overactive muscles, tightening up their underactive muscles, and getting them back to a neutral posture. And not only is that going to help them have like less aches and pains in the way that they move, it is also going to actually help with their breathing, and it will feel a lot easier to do cardio. Again, one more reason to why we do a couple stretches and we get into good alignment before we start exercising. So summarizing everything up, the respiratory system is going to gather all that oxygen from the environment. The cells are going to use that oxygen and produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which we need to get rid of the body. So your cardiovascular system is going to move the oxygen from the lungs to your tissues, and it's going to grab the CO2 and move it from your tissues to your lungs. And then your lungs are going to exchange that oxygen for CO2 with the atmosphere and pump that around. And if there is dysfunction in your cardiorespiratory system, that could lead to dysfunction in the human movement system. And so again, just one more example of everything in the body being very, very connected. Whew, you made it to the weekend, guys. How's everybody feeling?
Awesome.
Good. Excited.
I love that. Love that. Cool, guys. Well, Monday, we'll be moving. You know what, we talked a lot about oxygen today, and that was sort of like the most important nutrient, right? Well, we're going to start moving into our other nutrients, proteins, fats, and carbs on Monday. So we're going to get a little bit of nutrition talk in and start getting into and so we can sort of deeply understand metabolism And then that way we'll have a better understanding of why we choose certain rep ranges and things like that later down the line. But for now, we're sort of putting the pieces together. So yeah, we'll let you kill the recording. Whoop, and let you guys out.